Good evening, and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. In tonight's figure story, we enter the soul of a man the world remembers as the Lion of Britain. Yet behind the thunder of his speeches and the smoke of his cigars, there lived a trembling heart. In the quiet hours before the bombs fell, he sat alone in a room heavy with maps, telegrams, and prayer. When the world heard, "We shall fight on the beaches," heaven heard, "Lord, help me bear this weight." This is the story of a man who freed the world twice, first from tyranny and later from himself. It was 1940. The air over London shuddered with the low growl of engines. Sirens howled. The city's night sky flickered with red and orange bursts that lit up the windows of number 10 Downing Street. Inside, Winston Churchill, recently appointed Prime Minister, stood before his desk, staring at a candle flame that trembled more than he did. He was 65. The weight of an empire rested upon the shoulders of a man history already doubted, and perhaps so did he. Outside his door, the War Cabinet debated numbers, ships, soldiers, supplies, but Churchill wasn't thinking of numbers. He was thinking of souls. He whispered to the flame, "If you truly chose me, then give me the strength to bear your choice." In his private notes that night, he wrote only 7 words. "I felt as if I were walking with destiny." But destiny for him wasn't a crown. It was a cross. Hours earlier, as he prepared his first radio address to the nation, a secretary had found him pacing, muttering, rewriting. His cigar trembled between his fingers. "It isn't the enemy, I fear," he said softly. "It's failure and the silence of God." To the world, he would become a roar. But to himself, he was still that lonely boy in a cold boarding school hallway, begging someone to see him. He had learned early that courage was not the absence of fear. It was the mastery of it. Yet tonight, fear wasn't the enemy. Doubt was. He lit another cigar, the ember glowing like the last ember of faith inside him. He inhaled deeply, then exhaled through the word he wouldn't say aloud. Why me? Moments later, an officer entered, saluted, and reported, "Prime Minister, we've lost Dunkirk." Churchill didn't flinch. He simply closed his eyes. "No," he whispered, "we've not lost it yet. Not if we can still pray." And then, for the first time that day, he knelt beside the great oak desk. The sound of his knees against the floorboards was drowned by the sirens above. He prayed not for victory, but for mercy. "Let them see tomorrow, Lord," he said. "Let me see the end of this night." He didn't know that across the channel, in that same hour, thousands of young soldiers were also whispering the same words. That night became the beginning of everything, and the end of the man he once was. He would soon realize that God does not always grant peace to those who ask for it. Sometimes, he grants purpose instead. When the candle finally died, Churchill sat in darkness, the city shaking around him. He whispered again, "Very well then. If it is to be me, I shall not fail you." He rose, wiped his eyes, and walked back toward the light. The flame had gone out, but his conviction burned hotter than ever. He didn't yet know it, but God was already 3 steps ahead. The roar of warplanes that haunted his nights in 1940 was not the first roar Winston Churchill had heard in his life. Long before he commanded armies, he had fought a quieter, lonelier war, the kind that begins in a nursery and echoes through a lifetime. He was born into privilege, yet starved of affection. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, a brilliant but cold politician, treated him with distance that felt like punishment. His mother, Jenny Jerome, an American socialite, drifted through London's soirees, while her son waited for her letters that rarely came. Winston once wrote, "I loved her dearly, but at a distance that no love could bridge." At the age of 7, he was sent to boarding school, a small boy with a big heart, dressed in the uniform of expectation. The walls were gray, the corridors colder than the winter air, and the cane fell harder than any lesson could teach. Each night as the candles dimmed, he whispered to the darkness, "One day, I'll show them. One day, they'll listen." But the voice that promised the world his roar began as a cry for his mother's attention. One Christmas, when other boys were called home, Winston stayed behind. Snow fell outside the window of Harrow School, and the young boy watched it silently, writing letters that would never be answered. He drew soldiers in the margins, knights, warriors, men who could not be ignored. Perhaps he was already sketching the shadow of the man he would become. One teacher said, "Churchill is a dull boy, incapable of success." But Winston's mind wandered far beyond arithmetic, into battles, speeches, and empires not yet written. He was not dull. He was simply waiting for the world to catch up. Years later, when journalists asked how he found courage during the Blitz, he replied, half smiling, "I had plenty of practice being alone with fear." And it was true. Fear had been his oldest companion, the one that sharpened his wit and hardened his will. When others sought comfort, he sought challenge. When others prayed for ease, he prayed for endurance. He would later say, "Kites rise highest against the wind, not with it." But few knew that the wind he spoke of was not the gale of politics or war. It was the chill of childhood neglect. The boy who longed for his parents' approval became the man who demanded the world's. In his 20s, when he entered the army, he didn't join for duty alone. He joined to be seen, to matter. He volunteered for every front that promised danger. He wrote letters to his mother from India, from Sudan, from Cuba, as if the sound of gunfire might finally carry his voice far enough to reach her heart. "I have faced bullets," he once wrote, "but never silence as cruel as the one that raised me." That silence became his tutor. It taught him that courage could be manufactured, that if no one else believed in him, he would build his own belief. Yet, in that defiance, a seed of pride was planted, one that would one day make him question whether he was leading by faith or by ego. And pride, as he would learn, is a fire that burns its wielder as much as it lights his path. Decades later, when Londoners gathered in bomb shelters to hear his voice on the radio, they called it the voice of courage. But perhaps it was more than that. Perhaps it was the echo of that abandoned boy who refused to be silent any longer. He spoke not merely to lead his nation, he spoke to heal himself. Each syllable carried a lifetime of loneliness, transformed into purpose. Each pause hid a prayer, "Let them never feel as forgotten as I once was." And yet, even in victory, the wound remained. For all his bravado, he often feared that he had inherited his father's curse. Brilliance shadowed by self-destruction. He would drink to silence the ghosts and paint to calm his storms. But beneath it all, the child still whispered, "Am I brave, Lord, or merely loud?" He didn't know it yet, but the next decade would test that question in fire and blood. Because soon, Churchill would discover that courage, born of loneliness, is only the beginning. Faith, on the other hand. Faith is what survives when courage dies. And faith was about to be all he had left. He was 24 when he first met death face to face, and found, to his own surprise, that he rather liked the conversation. In 1899, the British Empire was at war again, this time in South Africa, against the Boers. Winston Churchill, already known as a restless cavalry officer turned journalist, had come to report the war. But deep inside, he wasn't there to observe history. He was there to enter it. He was still the boy who needed to prove he was more than a disappointment, more than his father's fading name. Every bullet that whistled past him was a question. "Do you see me now?" He would later call it a grand adventure, but it was something darker, a search for meaning through danger. When the train he rode was ambushed by Boer commandos, shells tearing through metal and screams, Churchill ran toward the gunfire, not away from it. He helped wounded men to safety, even as bullets cracked the air around him. He was captured that day, thrown into a prisoner of war camp in Pretoria, and there, behind barbed wire and iron gates, he faced a different kind of battle: stillness. "To be still," he wrote, "is the worst fate for a man born to movement." But one night, under a moon as pale as freedom, he made a decision that would change everything. He escaped. Barefoot, hungry, and hunted, he walked 200 miles through enemy territory. For days, he drank from muddy rivers and hid in coal trains. When he finally reached a British safe house, he was half-starved, but grinning. The London papers called it a daring escape by Mr. Churchill. He called it Providence. I was guided, he told his mother, by some unseen hand that refused to let me die. Even then, he sensed that fate had a strange intimacy with him. He began to believe that he had been spared for a purpose. But purpose can intoxicate a man even more than victory. When he returned to England, he was celebrated like a hero. Crowds cheered, newspapers sang his name, and Parliament opened its doors to him. The prodigal son of Britain had returned, not with his father's charm, but with something rarer: survival. He entered politics the next year, carrying not humility, but the swagger of a man who believed God himself had intervened on his behalf. He once told a friend, half-jokingly, "There's no better way to test one's faith than to be shot at without result." Behind the humor, there was a truth. His survival fed his belief that destiny had singled him out. He wasn't wrong, but he misunderstood what destiny was for. Because destiny, as he would later learn, doesn't always protect, it prepares. The God who saves a man from one bullet may still let him face another, this time of the soul. And Churchill's soul was not yet ready for peace. He craved battle because silence terrified him. He chased danger because safety felt like failure. And each triumph stitched pride a little deeper into his skin. He would soon find out that pride and calling often wear the same uniform, until the day they turn their weapons on each other. In the following years, he rose fast. Too fast. His speeches dazzled. His wit cut like steel. His confidence electrified Parliament. He once said, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." But he hadn't yet learned what that sentence costs, because soon, in the Dardanelles, on a rocky peninsula called Gallipoli, his brilliance would betray him. The Empire's sons would die by the thousands under his plan. And for the first time in his life, he would face the one enemy he could not outtalk, outrun, or outshine: failure. The escape from the Boer camp had given him the illusion of divine favor. Gallipoli would show him that divine favor and divine testing often come wrapped in the same event. He had once asked the moon to light his way to freedom. Soon he would beg the same moon to forgive him for the price of his ambition. He didn't know it yet, but the fire that had forged his courage was about to melt his pride. And only then would God begin shaping the man who would one day save the world. In every great life, there comes a moment when triumph turns on itself. When the applause that once lifted a man becomes the echo that buries him. For Winston Churchill, that moment was called Gallipoli. It was 1915. He was First Lord of the Admiralty, the youngest to ever hold the post, and he believed he could outthink the war itself. While generals argued over trenches in France, Churchill dreamed of breaking the stalemate by sea, launching an assault on the Dardanelles Strait, to open a path to Constantinople and strike the heart of the Ottoman Empire. It was bold, it was brilliant, and it was doomed. He was warned it was too risky. But when you believe destiny favors you, caution sounds like cowardice. "I cannot sit still while men rot in mud," he told his aides. "Better to fail in action than succeed in idleness." He signed the order. Thousands of ships moved across the Aegean, and within weeks, thousands of lives were lost. The campaign collapsed. Bodies washed ashore like the wreckage of a dream. The Dardanelles became not a doorway to victory, but a graveyard of hope. Newspapers called it Churchill's folly. Parliament turned its back. His colleagues whispered, "The boy who would be Napoleon has learned he is mortal." Churchill, once the darling of the empire, became its disgrace. One evening, as rain drummed against the windows of Admiralty House, he sat alone in silence. The maps that once thrilled him now mocked him. He ran his finger along the black lines of the Dardanelles, lines that led nowhere. "All my brilliant plans," he murmured, "and not one to bring them home alive." He closed his eyes, and in that moment, something inside him broke. Not the fire, but the pride. He wrote in his diary, "I am finished. I have no ambition left. I only hope to see peace before I die." But God, in his strange arithmetic, sometimes subtracts before he multiplies. He was not finished. he was being emptied. He resigned his post and withdrew from government life. Newspapers mocked him. Friends disappeared. For months, he wandered like a ghost through his estate at Chartwell, painting sunsets no one would see. He painted because words failed him. He painted because only color could speak the things shame could not. And in the stillness of those brushstrokes, a new kind of courage began to form. Not to command, but to endure. Each morning, he woke before dawn, fed his fish, tended to his garden, and said aloud, "One must rebuild one's faith, stroke by stroke." It was not faith in government or glory, but in the mysterious mercy that allows a man to fall without being forsaken. Sometimes at night he would sit beside Clementine, his wife, staring into the fire. She would ask softly, "Do you ever think of them, the men?" He'd nod. "Every night," he'd whisper, "they march through my sleep." There were no medals for remorse. But perhaps there was grace in it. He once said, "Success is never final. Failure is never fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." Those weren't the words of a confident man. They were the confession of one who had met himself and survived. By the time he re-entered politics years later, he was no longer the reckless soldier who chased glory. He had learned to listen to silence, to bow to uncertainty, and to accept that sometimes divine mercy arrives disguised as humiliation. The fall of the rising star had forged something rarer than ambition. It had forged wisdom, and wisdom would soon become his only weapon, because the world was heading toward a darkness deeper than Gallipoli, and only a man who had already lost everything could one day stand against it. Was it failure, he once asked, or preparation? Perhaps heaven builds its leaders from rubble, so when the storm comes, they already know how to stand. The world often forgets that between a man's two greatest victories lies his longest silence. For Winston Churchill, that silence stretched nearly a decade, years history called the wilderness, but heaven might have called training in solitude. It was the 1930s. The empire he once served proudly was tired of war and hungry for illusion. Britain danced in the glitter of the Jazz Age, pretending that peace was permanent. And Churchill, the fallen prophet of Gallipoli, warned of a coming storm no one wanted to hear. He stood again in the House of Commons, older, humbled, and haunted. "Germany," he said, "is arming, and we are asleep." The chamber rustled with laughter, not fear. They called him alarmist, outdated, obsessed. Newspapers caricatured him as a madman waving ghosts in an empty hall. But his voice, once adored, had become an inconvenience to comfort. When others saw prosperity, he saw preparation for catastrophe. When others toasted peace, he smelled smoke. He would write late into the night, stacks of paper rising around him like fortifications. He studied Hitler's speeches, dissected military budgets, and wrote memoranda that ministers discarded. And sometimes, when exhaustion overtook him, he would stare into the fire and whisper, "Why show me, Lord, what others cannot see?" There was no answer, just the crackle of wood and the weight of waiting. Isolation has its own kind of battlefield. It doesn't kill the body. It tests the spirit. And Churchill's spirit was fighting despair. He had returned to painting and bricklaying at Chartwell. He built walls with his bare hands, stone by stone, perhaps trying to rebuild the confidence Gallipoli had shattered. He once told a friend, half smiling, "A man who builds a wall can forget for a while that he has been walled off." He wrote history books to feed his family, gave lectures to pay his debts, and filled his estate with animals to drown the silence. To the world, he looked eccentric. But deep down, he was learning the hardest art of leadership, how to wait without bitterness. In 1933, when Hitler rose to power, Churchill's fears took shape. He studied the German chancellor's words, underlined every mention of war, and felt a chill run through his bones. At dinner one night, a guest mocked him. "Surely, Mr. Churchill, this man is no threat to Europe." Churchill replied quietly, "Then may God forgive us all when he proves otherwise." Still, no one listened, and perhaps, in that loneliness, God was preparing his voice. not for approval, but for truth. For truth rarely arrives in the midst of applause. He faced ridicule, rejection, and financial ruin. His own party distanced itself from him. Letters from friends dwindled. Even Clementine worried for his mind. But Churchill refused to surrender the vision placed in his heart. He began to see his suffering differently, not as punishment, but as refinement. He told his secretary once, "I have been through the fire. It burns, yes, but it also purifies." And somewhere in that solitude, he began to reconcile the man of pride with the man of purpose. He learned to pray again, not for recognition, but for readiness. When Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia in 1938, the world gasped. Churchill didn't. He only sighed and said, "The era of procrastination is over. The era of consequences has begun." Suddenly, the madman no one would hear became the prophet everyone quoted. The wilderness had ended. Destiny was knocking again, louder than ever. He was 65 when the call came. Neville Chamberlain resigned. The nation needed a leader who feared nothing. And in that moment, every humiliation, every exile, every lonely prayer found its purpose. When he walked into Buckingham Palace to accept the king's invitation to form a government, he paused at the door and whispered to himself, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour." He was right, but destiny is never gentle. It saves its heaviest burdens for the shoulders it trusts most. The wilderness had refined him. Now war would define him. It was May 10th, 1940. Europe was falling apart. Hitler had invaded France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Neville Chamberlain, the weary Prime Minister of Britain, knew the storm had broken beyond his strength. That morning, the telephone rang at Chartwell. The voice on the line was clipped, formal, historic. "The king would like to see Mr. Churchill at once." He hung up slowly, the weight of the words pressing into his chest. He looked out at his garden, the roses he had planted, the fish pond he had built stone by stone, and knew he would not see them again for years, if ever. He told Clementine quietly, "It has come at last." And though her face was pale, she nodded. "Then go, Winston. You've waited your whole life to serve." When he arrived at Buckingham Palace, King George VI, nervous, young, uncertain, received him in silence. Churchill bowed slightly. The king said simply, "I want to ask you to form a government." Churchill later wrote, "I knew as I left his presence that I was walking with destiny, and that my whole past life had been but a preparation for this hour." But what he didn't write was how much his hands shook when he got back into the car. Because destiny, as he was learning, never feels glorious up close. It feels like terror, wrapped in obedience. That night he returned to Downing Street, the same place where his pride had once broken, now turned into his battlefield and his sanctuary. He sat alone before the fire, a pen in his hand, staring at the empty paper that would soon carry his first words as Prime Minister. He didn't begin with strategy. He began with prayer. "Lord," he whispered, "I am here. I am old and imperfect. But if this is your will, make me ready and hold me up when I falter." Then he began to write. His first message to the nation wasn't about victory or vengeance. It was a confession of reality and of courage. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." The sentence was raw, stripped of rhetoric, carved straight from the heart of a man who had nothing left to prove, only something left to give. As he rehearsed it aloud, his secretary noticed that his eyes glistened, not with pride, but with fear. He wasn't afraid to die. He was afraid to fail the purpose that had finally revealed itself. When he stepped before Parliament, the air was thick with tension. Many still doubted him, the man who had once brought Gallipoli. He looked across the sea of faces and saw skepticism, fatigue, dread. But he began anyway, his voice gravelly and certain. "You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war, by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us." The word God trembled in the hall. Even those who doubted faith felt something stir. because when conviction is born of humility, it sounds like truth. He ended with, "You ask, what is our aim?" I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. For without victory, there is no survival. There was silence, then thunderous applause. But as he sat down, his face did not show triumph, only exhaustion. He turned to an aide and whispered, "I hope to be worthy of this terrible task." That night, as bombs fell over Rotterdam, Churchill stood on the balcony of 10 Downing Street and looked up at the blackened sky. Flames flickered in the distance, like the candles of a dying world. He murmured to himself, "I am prepared to meet whatever comes. But I am not sure the world is." Then, in that moment, something extraordinary happened. He felt peace, not the peace of assurance, but of surrender. For the first time in his life, he stopped fighting destiny and simply walked with it. What he didn't know then, what no one could, was that the call of leadership would not only ask him to save a nation, it would ask him to confront the ghost that had haunted him since childhood, the loneliness of carrying a weight no one else could see. And the greater the light of destiny shone, the darker that loneliness would become. He feared his pride had brought him here, the historians would write, but perhaps pride was only the fire God used to light his courage. The storm had arrived, and the storm had teeth. By late May of 1940, the British Expeditionary Force, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, was trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. The German army closed in like a tightening noose. The sea lay before them, the enemy behind. London braced for the unthinkable, the annihilation of its sons. Inside the war rooms beneath Whitehall, maps spread across the table like a surgeon's open chest. Red pins marked the trapped divisions. Blue ones showed the line collapsing hour by hour. Churchill stared at them without blinking. Someone whispered, "Prime Minister, the situation is hopeless." He didn't answer right away. Then he said softly, "Nothing is hopeless while men still breathe, and God still listens." Outside, the world saw him as unshakable, a mountain of resolve. But that night, in his private diary, he wrote, "The whole root and core and brain of the British Army seems about to perish upon the field or be led into captivity." He walked alone through the corridors, cigar smoke trailing behind like incense in a church. The walls vibrated faintly with the distant hum of bombers. He murmured to himself, "So, this is the test." And it was not of strategy, but of soul. Because sometimes, faith is not believing that you will be delivered. It's believing that meaning still exists if you aren't. Then came a spark, a whisper really, from the Admiralty. What if we use the small boats? Civilian vessels, fishing trawlers, ferries, tugboats. Anything that could float. A desperate, absurd idea. But Churchill's eyes lit up. Every ship, every sailor, every soul who can steer, send them. He knew it wouldn't save them all. But perhaps mercy could save what pride could not. In that moment, he chose compassion over conquest, life over legacy. For days, the sea became a highway of hope. Little boats crossed under enemy fire, rescuing boys who had once thought themselves forgotten. From the cliffs of Dover, mothers stood with binoculars, whispering prayers that drifted over the waves. By June 4th, more than 300,000 men had returned. They called it the miracle of Dunkirk. Churchill didn't call it that, not at first. He was too tired to see miracles. He paced his office, cigar unlit, and whispered, "We shall fight on." But later, when alone with Clementine, he admitted, "A miracle of deliverance? Yes, and not of our making." He stood before Parliament the next day and spoke words that shook the world. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." The chamber erupted. But those who saw him leave noticed his eyes glisten, not with triumph, but with tears. Because behind the roar of his words was the weight of the names he would never forget. That night he visited the docks to greet the returning soldiers, mud-caked, trembling, some barely older than his own children. He removed his hat. "Welcome home, lads," he said. "You've done more than you'll ever know." A boy saluted him, then asked quietly, "Did we win, sir?" Churchill looked at him for a long moment and replied, "You survived." That's the first victory any man can hope for. Later, as he sat again by the fire, he finally allowed himself to exhale. The flames danced against the walls like the ghosts of the saved. He murmured, "Greatness, I think, is not in conquest, but in compassion." The same God who had humbled him at Gallipoli had lifted him now through mercy. The man once broken by pride had learned the power of surrender. When he closed his eyes, he could almost hear the echo of oars, the creak of wooden hulls, the whisper of the sea carrying home the sons of Britain. And in that faint melody, he felt something he had not felt in years: peace. But peace, he knew, never lasts long for those chosen to carry history. The bombs would soon fall on London. The war would enter its darkest hour, and he would again have to speak when even his own heart trembled. "He didn't win by might that night," a soldier once said. "He won by mercy." Perhaps that was the point, that even lions must learn to kneel before heaven before they roar before men. By the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe's bombers darkened the sky. Every night, sirens wailed like the city's own heartbeat, and searchlights clawed through clouds looking for the next wave of death. Children slept in subway tunnels. Churches turned into shelters. Streets became scars. And above it all, one voice, rough, trembling, defiant, rose through the static. "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, so that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, 'This was their finest hour.'" It was not just a speech, it was a prayer disguised as thunder. Every night before addressing the nation, Churchill would sit alone in his underground war room, face pale under the yellow lamp. He'd place his cigar beside him, fold his hands, and close his eyes for a brief silence. His staff often thought he was rehearsing. He wasn't. He was praying. "Give me words, Lord, not to boast, but to bind their hearts." Then he'd rise, straighten his waistcoat, and march toward the microphone. By the time the red light blinked on, the trembling was gone. His voice filled homes, barracks, and hospitals. Heavy, human, and somehow holy. He spoke of courage, but he did not hide fear. He spoke of resolve, but he did not promise safety. He offered no illusions, only dignity. That was his gift. He didn't lift the burden from his people. He taught them how to carry it. One evening, after finishing a particularly rousing broadcast, he returned to his chair. The operator had turned off the microphone, but the echo of his own words still rang in his ears. He poured himself a drink and said softly, almost to himself, "They think I am strong, but every word costs me." Then, staring at the empty glass, he whispered, "Lord, I've given them courage. Please give me some back." Outside, the rumble of bombs grew louder. The walls shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. He didn't flinch. He just reached for the radio dial and tuned in to hear the distant hum of his own broadcast replaying. For a moment, he wasn't the leader of a nation, just an old man listening to his own prayer bounce back across the airwaves. One night, he visited the ruins of a church destroyed by bombing. The stone floor was still warm with embers. The rector, a frail man in soot-stained robes, greeted him. "They bombed us again, sir." Churchill looked up at the shattered stained glass, the hole where Christ's face had been blown away, and said quietly, "They cannot bomb out the light that built this." Then he knelt, pressed his fingers to the charred floor, and prayed again, not for victory but for endurance. Because endurance, he had learned, was the truest miracle of all. Weeks later, during another air raid, he walked through the East End. Firemen were still dousing flames. A woman, her face streaked with soot, recognized him and shouted, "We're still here, Winnie!" The crowd laughed, cheered. Some even cried. Churchill tipped his hat and replied, "So am I, my dear. So am I." It was a moment of shared defiance between the governed and the governing. Two sides of the same suffering. In that instant, the myth of the lion and the humility of the man became one. The newspapers called him the voice that carried a nation. But few knew that sometimes Minutes before those speeches, his own hand shook so violently that he had to steady it on the desk. Few knew that after each broadcast, he would retreat to his study, collapse into his chair, and sit in silence for long minutes before speaking again. "They heard thunder," he once told Clementine, "but heaven heard prayer." And perhaps that's why his words outlived him, because they were born not in politics, but in petition. London would keep burning. The Blitz would rage for months. But through every dark night, that same voice returned. Gravelly, tender, firm, like a lighthouse guiding ships through fog. He wasn't just telling them to fight. He was reminding them that faith still existed somewhere in the smoke. The world heard thunder, the historian wrote, but heaven heard prayer. And in that strange duet between heaven and earth, one tired man became the instrument of endurance itself. By the winter of 1940, the war was no longer a distant horror. It was at the doorstep. Bombs fell every night. The air smelled of ash and cordite. The people of London slept beneath the earth in underground stations, while above them, their homes and churches burned. And still, the man they called the Lion walked the streets without fear. Churchill insisted on seeing the aftermath with his own eyes. His bodyguards pleaded, "Prime Minister, it's not safe!" He growled, "Then the king himself is not safe, nor is the poorest man in London. Let us share our dangers." He would drive through bombed neighborhoods in the early morning hours, cigar clenched between his teeth, coat collar turned up, the smell of smoke clinging to him like armor. Children would wave from the rubble, and he'd tip his hat, eyes wet. "They bombed us again last night," one little girl told him. He smiled sadly. "Yes, my dear," he said, "but you see, we're still here." To the public, he was indestructible. But to those who knew him, he was fragile, haunted by a private question that kept him awake at night. If God is with us, why does he allow this? He had seen cathedrals crumble and innocent blood stain the streets, and yet he still believed. Or perhaps he simply refused not to believe. Because if there was no divine hand guiding history, then all his pain had been for nothing, and Churchill could endure anything except meaninglessness. One evening after a particularly brutal raid, he visited a small parish in South London. The church was nearly gone. Only the bell tower remained, leaning like a wounded soldier. Inside the ruins, a priest swept glass from the pews. Churchill stepped over the rubble and said softly, "I don't understand it, Father. Why does he allow it?" The priest stopped sweeping, looked up and said, "Perhaps he is not allowing it, sir. Perhaps he is enduring it with us." Churchill stared at him. The words struck deeper than any sermon. Enduring it with us. That night he wrote in his journal, "There is no peace without suffering. There is no faith without doubt." He began attending prayers more often, quietly, humbly, without ceremony. Those who saw him noticed that when the hymns played, he would not sing. He would listen. Perhaps he was trying to hear the voice that had guided him through his darkest years, wondering why it was silent now. Clementine once found him late at night, sitting in his study, head bowed. "Winston," she said gently, "you should sleep." He looked up at her with tired eyes. "Do you think," he asked, "God chose me for this? Or am I just his instrument of noise?" She smiled faintly. "Maybe both. But even instruments need breath to make sound. And perhaps his breath is in you." He said nothing, but his eyes glistened. She left him with the silence he needed to turn her words over in his mind. As the months dragged on, his faith changed shape. It was no longer the faith of a man who believed he was chosen. It became the faith of a man who trusted that even chaos has purpose. He stopped asking, "Why me?" and started whispering, "Still me." He once told a friend, "I no longer look for the hand of God in victory. I see it in endurance." When St. Paul's Cathedral survived a direct hit, bombs landing all around it but not destroying it, Churchill visited the next day. He stood beneath the dome, sunlight spilling through the broken windows, and whispered, "You see, he leaves us a sign to remind us he's still near." It was one of the few moments he allowed himself to weep. The faith that survived the fire was not naive or triumphant. It was weary, cracked, scarred, but alive. And that was enough, because faith, like courage, is not measured in certainty, but in the will to keep walking when the sky itself seems to fall. Perhaps, he would later write, faith is not found in the church or the chaplain's prayer. It is found when a man walks through hell and still believes there's light at the end, even if he cannot yet see it. He didn't know it, but the darkest night of all was still ahead. And this time, it wouldn't be the city under fire. It would be him. By 1941, Winston Churchill had learned that victory demanded not only strength, but surrender. And now, in the long, sleepless hours between midnight and dawn, he began to unravel. The war raged endlessly. Cities crumbled, men died, and the line between endurance and despair blurred. To the public, Churchill still thundered from podiums, his voice ironclad. But when the doors closed and the applause faded, he sank into a silence as heavy as the war itself. He called it his black dog. That was his name for depression, the shadow that followed him from childhood, now growing large enough to swallow even his courage. One evening, as the bombing quieted outside, his secretary found him sitting in the dark, a single lamp illuminating his face, papers scattered, untouched. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked. He exhaled. "The nation is weary," he said, "and so is its shepherd." That night, he wrote in his private notes, "There are moments when I feel utterly alone. The burdens are too great. I wonder if God grows tired of me, as I grow tired of myself." He poured a drink, stared into the glass, and muttered, "I have offered all I can. If he still requires more, he must give me another heart." It wasn't blasphemy. It was exhaustion made holy. Clementine tried to comfort him. "You've done enough, Winston. You've held the world together." But he shook his head, "And yet the world still falls apart. What if my strength is only delaying the inevitable?" She reached for his hand. "Then delay it, my love, until heaven decides otherwise." He smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes glistening. "You always did have more faith than me." She kissed his forehead. "No," she said softly. "I just believe your fight is his way of showing us what faith looks like in motion." For days afterward, Churchill barely slept. The pressure of command pressed upon him like a vice. Each telegram from the front carried the names of the fallen. Each strategy demanded sacrifice. He began to doubt his instincts, his mission, even his calling. Was he truly walking with destiny, or just dragging it behind him? Then, one morning, came a telegram from across the ocean. It was from President Franklin D. Roosevelt. "You are not alone. America stands with Britain." Churchill stared at it in silence, then whispered, "At last the stars move again." He stepped outside into the thin winter light. Snow fell over London. Soft, white, almost forgiving. For the first time in months, the sky didn't roar. He later described that day as the turning point, the moment the black dog loosened its grip. He told an aide, "I had prayed for relief. I did not expect it to arrive as friendship." Perhaps that was the hidden lesson, that divine answers rarely appear as miracles. Sometimes they come as allies. That evening, he returned to his desk and began drafting another address. He stared at the paper for a long time before writing just one line. "We have not journeyed so far because we are clever, but because we are carried." He stopped, read it aloud, then smiled through tears. "Yes," he whispered, "carried." He looked up at the ceiling, as though the unseen hand that had spared him so many times still hovered there. And for the first time in weeks, he whispered a prayer of gratitude, not plea. Later that night, Clementine passed by his study door and saw the light still on. She peeked in. He was asleep in his chair, pen still in hand, cigar burned out. The page beside him bore only 2 words: "Thank you." When he awoke the next morning, something had shifted. The darkness hadn't vanished, but he was no longer afraid of it. He had accepted that even the bravest hearts break, and that brokenness, when offered upward, can still be used. "The Lord does not promise the absence of storms," he told his aide later, only the strength to stand through them. He straightened his tie, took up his cane, and prepared to face another day of war. The world outside was still chaos, but inside him, the silence had become steady, not empty, but sacred. And though he didn't yet know it, that long night of despair would become the hinge of his fate, the moment when pride gave way to prayer and history began to heal its own leader. It was June 4th, 1940. 338,000 soldiers had crossed the Channel back to England, rescued from the jaws of annihilation. The miracle was so vast, so improbable, that even Churchill struggled to describe it. He stood before Parliament, voice trembling, not from weakness, but from awe. "We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of victory," he said. "Wars are not won by evacuations." And yet, in his heart, he knew something holy had brushed across the water. Later that night, when the cheering in the streets finally faded, he retreated to his study and closed the door. Alone again, he whispered, "So you heard us after all." Then he wept. The nation called him the savior of Britain, but Churchill knew better. He had seen too much chaos, too much failure, to mistake providence for personal credit. He told his staff, "I did not lead them home. I merely did not stop them from being led." The newspapers wrote of luck. He wrote of mercy. Days later, he received a letter from a clergyman who thanked him for his leadership. The note ended with, "God works through his chosen." Churchill read it twice, then smiled sadly. "If I am chosen," he said, "it must be for my thick skin, not my saintly soul." But when his secretary later gathered his drafts, she noticed something scrawled faintly in the margins of one speech. "I am not the architect of deliverance, only the witness." He was beginning to see the divine thread woven through his failures and victories alike. Gallipoli, the wilderness years, the sleepless nights. None of it wasted, all of it shaping him for this moment. That same week, King George VI called for a national day of prayer. Churches overflowed, queues formed outside cathedrals. The footage still survives. Millions of Britons kneeling in the streets, silent, humble, desperate. Even in the age of reason, they remembered the power of reverence, and in that united kneeling, Churchill saw something he had never seen before, a nation not begging for escape, but for endurance. "If we are to survive," he wrote, "it will not be by our guns or ships, but by the invisible cords that bind a people to their maker." Then came the news. Incredible, impossible. Hitler had halted his armored divisions. The German advance paused for 3 crucial days, allowing the evacuation to continue. No one could explain it. Historians still debate why. Churchill didn't bother to. He simply looked up from the telegram, muttered, "Even the devil obeys when heaven commands," and returned to work. That evening, he visited Westminster Abbey. It was quiet, the candles still burning from the day's prayers. He sat in the back pew, away from the altar, hat in his hands. His security detail kept their distance. He bowed his head and whispered, "You do not owe us another miracle, Lord. But if you must break me to give them hope, so be it." It wasn't rhetoric, it was surrender. He understood now that leadership wasn't about conquering nations. It was about yielding to the will that governed them all. When he returned home, Clementine was waiting by the fire. He said softly, "They call it a miracle." She smiled. "And what do you call it?" He stared into the flames for a long moment. A second chance. He turned to her. "Not for me, for mankind." Later that night, as London slept under the thin peace between raids, Churchill stood at his window and watched the stars shimmer faintly above the smoke. He whispered, "Perhaps God does not favor one nation over another, but he favors those who refuse to surrender hope." And somewhere between exhaustion and revelation, he realized what his mission truly was, not to defeat Hitler, but to defend humanity's faith in itself. He stopped trying to lead history, a biographer would later write, and began to serve it. Maybe that's how miracles work, not as interruptions from above, but as awakenings within. The man who once chased glory had finally met grace, and the world, though still on fire, had found a reason to believe it might survive the night. May 8th, 1945. Church bells rang, flags unfurled. London erupted in tears and laughter. The war was over, the enemy defeated, the tyrant in Berlin gone. Crowds flooded Trafalgar Square and Piccadilly Circus. Strangers embraced, soldiers wept, children danced in the streets, and somewhere in the middle of that celebration, Winston Churchill, the man who had carried Britain through hell, stood at a window and felt empty. He had waited 6 years for this day. And yet, as he looked down at the cheering masses, he whispered, "They cheer for peace, but I can already feel the loneliness returning." Because when a man's whole being is bound to a purpose, what happens when that purpose ends? That morning, he had stood before Parliament and declared, "We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but let us not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead." But even as the chamber thundered in applause, he caught himself thinking of the graves, the empty chairs, the boys who never came home. Victory had been purchased at a price only God could count. That night he went for a walk, alone as usual. The air smelled of wet brick and ashes. London was free, but its ruins glowed faintly in the moonlight, like wounds that had learned to heal in silence. He stopped by Westminster Bridge, leaning on his cane, listening to the faint hum of life returning to the city he loved. Then he whispered into the wind, "We have survived the fire. Now may we survive the peace." Peace, he soon discovered, can be crueler than war. For war demands action, but peace demands humility. And humility was a language he was still learning to speak. Within months, the elections came. The very people who had hailed him as their savior now longed for change. They voted him out. The architect of victory was dismissed by his own nation. When the results arrived, Clementine watched him quietly fold the telegram and place it in his pocket. He said only, "They have the right. After all, I told them to fight for it." She touched his shoulder. "Does it hurt?" He smiled faintly. "It hurts. But perhaps it is right that the lion should rest." That evening, as the sun dipped over the garden at Chartwell, he sat by the pond and fed the fish again, just as he had during his wilderness years. He stared at their rippling reflections and muttered, "The man who saved his people is no longer needed by them." Then, after a pause, he added softly, "Was that betrayal or liberation?" Maybe both. In his solitude, he turned again to painting. The brush moved slowly, thoughtfully. Each stroke was less about capturing beauty and more about understanding time, the strange mercy that takes away applause and replaces it with perspective. He once told a friend, "I find comfort in painting. The canvas cannot argue. It only reflects what's in one's soul," and what was in his soul now was not rage or pride, but something gentler. Release. He wrote memoirs, traveled, lectured, smiled for cameras. But the real Churchill, the man beneath the armor, had changed. He no longer spoke of destiny. He spoke of duty, and sometimes quietly of divine irony that the same God who had once lifted him to lead now taught him how to let go. He said half to himself, "The price of greatness is responsibility." And sometimes, that responsibility is to step aside. The night before he left office, he wrote one final note to his staff. "Do not think me sad. I have had my time upon the stage. I only hope I played my part well enough to earn the author's approval." He underlined author, because by now, he knew who had written the script all along. When dawn came, he rose early, put on his hat, and walked slowly toward the car that would take him away from Downing Street. The driver asked if he'd like to take one last look back. Churchill shook his head. "No," he said. "The play goes on, and I have no wish to disturb the next act." He smiled faintly, then murmured, "God save the Queen, and God forgive me my pride." The man who had conquered the darkest night, a historian wrote later, was undone not by defeat, but by peace. But perhaps that was how heaven completes its lessons. Not with thunder, but with silence. Winston Churchill, now 76, returned to Downing Street. His hair was silver, his steps slower, his cigar shorter, but the flame behind his eyes still burned. As he entered number 10 again, he paused at the door, tracing his fingers along the brass. "You again?" he murmured with a smile. "Very well. Let us finish what we began." But this time, destiny felt different. The first time he had entered this house, he was a warrior. Now he was a witness. Britain was no longer the empire it had been. Rationing still lingered. Colonies stirred toward independence. The roar of the old lion had softened into a gravelly growl of wisdom. He no longer dreamed of conquering storms. He dreamed of calming them. When reporters asked what his new mission was, he answered simply, "To make peace with the world, and perhaps with myself." In cabinet meetings, he often drifted into silence, while others debated. When an aide once asked if he was unwell, he replied, "No, my boy. I'm merely listening for the still small voice that speaks after the noise has ended." He had spent a lifetime commanding. Now he was learning the art of yielding. The fire that once raged in him had become a hearth, steady, warm, reflective. The world was changing. The Cold War had begun. Nuclear weapons loomed. Churchill, once the voice of defiance, now spoke as a man who knew too well what defiance cost. At Westminster College in 1946, he had warned of an iron curtain descending across Europe. But privately, he longed for reconciliation. "I would rather walk with peace in both hands," he told his secretary, "than carry victory in one and ashes in the other." When he met with President Eisenhower in Washington, the two old soldiers shared brandy and silence more than strategy. At one point, Churchill said softly, "You know, Ike, it isn't triumph that haunts a man. It's the memory of those who never saw it." Eisenhower nodded. "And yet, Winston, you gave them the reason to fight." Churchill smiled faintly. "Perhaps. But only heaven can give a reason to rest." At home, he spent hours painting by the pond at Chartwell. He would sit for long stretches without speaking, brush moving slowly, hands steady despite the tremor of age. Visitors said his paintings glowed with serenity, not grandeur. He said, "I used to paint to escape. Now I paint to understand." Clementine would bring him tea and sit beside him in silence. Once she asked, "What are you painting today?" He answered, "Not a landscape, my dear, just light finding its way through clouds." When the Nobel Committee awarded him the Prize for Literature in 1953, he laughed aloud. Imagine that. Peace at last, delivered in the form of a pen. But privately, he knew it was more than honor. It was closure. The man who had wielded words as weapons was now being thanked for using them to preserve memory. He wrote, "We are all worms, but I do believe that I am a glowworm." And indeed he was. Small, flickering, yet enough to pierce the darkness. As the years advanced, his strength waned. Strokes dimmed his mind, but not his spirit. When doctors urged him to rest, he replied, "Rest is lovely, but I prefer the company of purpose." And yet beneath that humor, he was preparing for a quieter victory, the one he had never tasted before, inner peace. In 1955, he finally resigned as prime minister for the last time. This time there was no bitterness, no sense of loss. He left office with a smile, saying, "The lion's roar has served its turn. Let others sing now." As his car pulled away, crowds gathered to wave. He lifted his hat and whispered through the window, "Thank you for teaching me that even lions must learn to lie down." The lion's roar became a whisper of peace, wrote one of his aides. He had freed the world once from tyranny, and now he freed himself from pride. This was his second freedom, not from an enemy, but from the endless need to prove himself. He had finally made peace with the silence that once terrified him. In his final years, Winston Churchill lived at Chartwell, surrounded by books, paintings, and the whispers of time. The great speeches were behind him, the parades and applause just echoes in old recordings. The house was filled not with visitors, but with memories, and sometimes the ghosts of the men who never came home. Each morning he'd shuffle out to the terrace with his cane, a blanket draped over his knees, and stare across the valley. The mist rose slowly, soft and golden, like forgiveness made visible. He would sip his tea, smile faintly, and say to no one in particular, "How strange. that after all I've said, silence still says it better. His body weakened. His mind wandered. But there were flashes, moments when the old fire returned. He'd recount stories to his nurse with a mischievous grin, or quote Shakespeare with tears in his eyes. Sometimes in the middle of the night, he'd call for Clementine. "Clemmy," he'd whisper, "I had that dream again, the one where I'm walking through fire and smoke, and I hear a voice saying, 'It's over.'" She'd sit beside him, stroke his hair, and say, "It is over, Winston. You can rest now." He'd smile sadly. But resting is the hardest campaign of all. He had once written, "I am prepared to meet my Maker. Whether my Maker is prepared for the great ordeal of meeting me is another matter." Now, as the years dwindled, that line stopped being a joke and became a prayer. He began to speak of God differently, less as a commander, more as a companion. He would say to visitors, "I find that Providence has been both stern and kind. Stern in what it demanded of me, kind in never taking away the strength to endure it." He no longer tried to interpret the meaning of every trial. He accepted that some mysteries remain mercifully unsolved. One spring afternoon, he walked with Clementine by the pond where he used to paint. The cherry blossoms had just begun to fall, drifting like slow snow onto the water. He stopped, watching the petals swirl, and said quietly, "You know, my dear, I used to think the world was saved by great men. Now I think it's saved by small mercies. A kind word, a patient wife, a prayer whispered in the dark." Clementine smiled, though her eyes filled. "And by faith?" He nodded. "Yes, though not always the faith of the man leading. Often the faith of the ones following." They stood there for a while, the sound of birds and wind filling the silence that needed no words. In those final years, he became reflective, almost poetic. He wrote short notes to himself, fragments of thought scattered on his desk like leaves. "Courage is grace under pressure. There is no greater test of faith than survival. To endure, one must love the world even when it burns." His granddaughter once asked him, "Grandpapa, were you ever afraid?" He smiled, eyes soft with memory. "Always, my dear. But fear is just the prelude to faith." By 1964, his strength had nearly faded. He rarely left his bed. Doctors came and went. Visitors lowered their voices. But in those fading days, he seemed at peace, as if the war within had finally called a truce. One evening, his valet found him awake, gazing at the ceiling. "What are you thinking of, sir?" he asked. Churchill replied, "Of the long road and the hand that led me through it all." He smiled faintly. "I believe I've seen enough of life to trust that the author knows how it ends." He passed away quietly on January 24th, 1965, 70 years to the day after his father's death. The same hour, the same date. As if time itself had saluted him, the nation mourned. Bells tolled across Britain. The Thames, lined with thousands, stood in silence as his coffin passed. Even the cranes along the docks dipped their arms in respect. And above that solemn hush, one might imagine the faint echo of his voice. Courage, my friends. Courage still. He had once freed the world from tyranny. Now, by dying with grace, he freed it once more, from the illusion that greatness and peace cannot share the same heart. He joked with God, wrote one friend, but the ache was real. He lived as if purpose were prayer, and perhaps it was. In the decades after his passing, Winston Churchill's name became immortal, carved into statues, quoted in classrooms, echoed in the speeches of new leaders, who never met him but spoke as though they had. His words, "Never give in, their finest hour. Courage is what it takes to stand up and speak," became the language of perseverance itself. But the truest measure of his legacy was not found in marble or ink. It was found in the quiet faith of those he once inspired, the ordinary souls who refused to surrender hope when the world fell apart. Because what he left behind was more than victory. It was endurance wrapped in belief. There's a story few recall, that during his funeral, as his coffin was carried through St. Paul's Cathedral, two trumpeters stood on opposite balconies. The first played the last post, the call that marks a soldier's death. The notes echoed through the domes like a sigh from heaven. Then came a pause, and long, deliberate, reverent. And from the other side, the second trumpeter answered with reveille, the call of resurrection, the sound that says, "It is time to rise." It was Churchill's final request. He had written it himself, because even in death, he wanted to remind the world that endings are merely awakenings in disguise. The Lion of Britain had always feared being forgotten. Yet in the silence after his roar, his humanity proved louder than his legend. He had been proud, impatient, flawed, yet somehow chosen, and perhaps that is the point. Perhaps God does not choose perfect men to carry his plan, one historian wrote, only willing ones. Churchill's willingness was his offering. He stumbled, doubted, wept, and failed, yet still stood up when standing seemed impossible. And in doing so, he taught a generation that faith is not the absence of fear. It's the refusal to let fear have the final word. Years later, when Queen Elizabeth II reflected on his life, she said, "He mobilized the English language and sent it into battle." But what she did not say, and perhaps because only God could, was that he also mobilized heaven's silence and sent it into hearts. He showed the world that leadership without humility crumbles, and that courage without conscience is only noise. In every age since, when darkness rises again, whether in war, in grief, or in doubt, his shadow seems to stir near the firesides of men and women who wonder if they are strong enough for what lies ahead. And in that moment, his words return, not as rhetoric, but as prayer. Kites rise highest against the wind, not with it. And somewhere, unseen, the same hand that guided him through smoke and sorrow guides those who listen, not to his speeches, but to his silence. He had once asked if destiny had chosen him or tested him. In the end, perhaps it had done both. For God often tests the ones he chooses, not to see if they will succeed, but to see if they will remain faithful when they cannot. That is why his story endures, because it is not a tale of victory alone, but of surrender. It is not a hymn to empire, but a confession of human frailty redeemed by divine purpose. And if we look closely, we see in his life a mirror of our own, a struggle between pride and prayer, ambition and grace, fear and faith. And maybe that is why, even now, as the embers of his story glow in the hearth of time, we still feel him near. The old man by the fire, cigar in hand, eyes soft with memory, whispering to the restless and the weary. You were never meant to carry it all alone. You were meant to carry it through, with faith. So tonight, as our own world trembles in its modern storms, perhaps we remember what he learned too late. That greatness is not found in power, but in perseverance. That leadership is not command, but compassion. And that even the mightiest roar must one day kneel before the quiet voice that says, "Be still." And so, as the fire burns low and the night deepens, we close the circle once more. Thank you for being part of our little fireside tonight. If the story touched your heart, share it with the ones you love. And if you'd like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.